Cable Club, Saturday on C-SPAN, beginning at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific Time.
We'll continue now with the remainder of the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee hearing looking into the collapse of the investment firm Drexel Burnham Lambert.
Another moment for people to be seated. Let me say that on occasion we have the good fortune to have expert witnesses before the committee that I think bring very special insight and professional knowledge of a kind that we need to have and often are not able to have. And I think that applies to the witness that we now have, who has come at my personal invitation and which I greatly appreciate his willingness to accept my invitation. Jerome Kohlberg Jr. is someone that I know to be a very private and a modest man, and one who has always been extremely reluctant to make personal statements or appearances. And given this evident lack of need or interest for publicity as such, I'm especially grateful that he's accepted our invitation today, and I am very pleased that he has been willing to do so and to provide what expertise he can to us as we reflect not just on this case, but the broader ramifications and implications of the discussion that we have underway here. Mr. Kohlberg is the general partner of Kohlberg & Company, which is a private merchant banking firm specializing in management buyouts, which he founded in May of 1987. Previously, Mr. Kohlberg was founding general partner of Kohlberg Kravis Robertson Company from 1976 to 1987. Mr. Kohlberg was a senior partner and member of the executive committee at Bear Stearns & Company before founding what was known and is known as KKR. He holds an LLB from Columbia Law School and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Like some of the rest of us, has fought the whack shoot over there at the Baker Library in years past, and also has a BA from Swarthmore College. He's a member of the Board of Managers of Swarthmore and a trustee of Columbia University and the American Museum of Natural History. So I am very pleased that you're here today, and these are very important subjects, not just for this committee and the Senate and the Congress to understand, I think, but for the American people to be able to understand and make sense of. And I think you're able to help that process along. So let me at this time invite you to make whatever opening comments you think are appropriate, and then I have some questions I'd like to raise with you. Delighted to have you today.
Thank you, Senator.
And I may ask you just pull a microphone a little closer so the people behind you in the room can hear you clearly.
Thank you, Senator. I'm here to be of help if I possibly can. Let me first say that I'm very supportive of the committee's efforts to shed light on the trouble in the financial community as exemplified really by the Drexel matter. And I think that's more visible now than it was some months ago. Also, I'd like to just say that, as you know, or I hope you know, that I come to this forum, you certainly do, Senator, with a background in a fairly narrow segment of the financial community, namely known as leverage buyouts, although I started out in the industry a little more broadly. And I've always defined this as the purchase of a company for the long-term pull, with a prudent management, with a prudent amount of leverage, and where the management has an opportunity to become owners as well. And these transactions have, despite some to the contrary, have done well. I think they've proved themselves beneficial and profitable over time. The original merchant bankers, and may want to define that at some point, such as myself, make money when the investors make their money, or should make their money when the investors make their money. And such transactions, I believe, are able to work for the long term, carry a strong involvement for the investors and a commitment by management. They were not the more recent, to me, they're not the more recent phenomenon of a breakup of a company, often referred to as a leveraged liquidation. Now, I think it's abundantly clear that there have been excesses, and as a matter of fact, I'd like to put this in a little broader perspective. I think we could well look back on the 80s as a decade of excess. I feel that what we're endeavoring to get at today is a part of that longer and bigger picture. The 80s carried a general atmosphere, in my view at least, of laissez-faire, deregulation, increasing budget deficits, declining educational system, a declining work ethic, and the declining role of the family. It was in the earlier years of this decade and in this atmosphere that Drexel singled out and concentrated on the high-yield market, which came to be known as the junk market. Even here, one has to differentiate, among the many imaginative and different types of securities in these high-yield securities in the junk bond market, particularly those with cash returns and those without cash returns. There's a world of difference. There was a very legitimate crystallization that Drexel accomplished, but after time, excesses crept in everywhere in other firms, and not merely at this one firm. Buyers who bought these high-yield securities should not have bought them, particularly in the excesses that they did and outside the rule of prudence. Also, huge fees came into play for placing these securities, which fees began to naturally cloud, distort, or even corrupt judgment. It could be said that these fees, by definition, showed that the bonds were too risky. Conflicts of interest also set in and gradually permeated all too many transactions, once again clouding judgment. Firms oftentimes are on both sides, representing both seller and buyer, receiving fees for this, as well as raising money and receiving additional compensation on occasion in the form, oftentimes in the form of warrants. These fees were contingent upon the consummation of the transaction, which also includes the fairness opinions investment bankers provided. And naturally, it too influenced even the best of judgments. So too in the corporate world there were excesses. A void had been created ever since about the 1950s with the decline of the substantial and controlling such shareholders such as the DuPonts, Mellons, Rockefellers, etc., the names we all know and knew. And they used to watch over the companies, and at the same time, while they were protecting their own interest, they were protecting the interests of the small shareholder. Into this void, I think, stepped the CEO. And basically, we can go into that, had no one to whom he was truly accountable. Again, there followed excesses of compensation, perquisites, and resulting inefficiencies, and even lack of ability to compete, in my opinion, particularly these days vis-a-vis Japan, Germany, etc. The same thing, as you people here know, was happening in our world of government, which was also displaying excesses of corruption, increasing deficits, bloated military budgets, out-of-control health care, and hordes of homeless. What are the remedies? I think the machinery is already in place. I don't think we need more government. I think the banking agencies already have the power to discipline the excesses that exist there, both in the S&Ls and the commercial banks. The SEC particularly has the power, as we've seen the last couple of hours, the power of bringing sunshine to these excesses, exorbitant fees, conflicts of interest by bankers, investment bankers, merchant bankers, management, and also lawyers. I truly believe that the light of day will call forth the pressures of the marketplace, which will impose its own discipline. More government is not the answer, but better utilization of the agencies and the people that are in place. Now, there might be a few suggestions that I'd put forth, such as the banning of green mail and the two-tier tender offer, which I think are being considered and on the way to, I hope, to being accomplished. But also, I think, particularly at the SEC, there needs to be more thought regarding rules for the conflict of interest, as well as definitions of independence for directors and others. I think a more recent phenomenon where some of the pension funds, particularly the state pension funds of California and New York, are making an effort to step into this void that I think exists in our corporate structure. And I think that should be encouraged by the SEC. I think more light, again, should be shed on anybody that deals with the public. And these pension funds today own really more than 50% of our companies and should be given information. Their words should be listened to. Their interests should be regarded. And the best way to do that is to put the light of day on this. And I think the proxy machinery that presently exists is still stems from the older days of the and is slanted too much toward the management, toward the corporation itself. And that really concludes my statement, Mr. Chairman. There was a couple of things that I noted while the testimony of the Commissioner was going on. I might just mention that.
Please do.
I think it's somewhat clear that the SEC could use a little strengthening, particularly in the muscle of having the muscle to require numbers. And it may well be that you want to consider that anybody that deals with the public, whether it's through a subsidiary or not, should be subject to that same scrutiny. I know that applies in the banking world, that if you own a bank, anything else you do is subject to their scrutiny as well. Senator Shelby, I recall, is being concerned with the capital needs of this country. I think he's right. I don't think the high-yield market is going away. I think it will be there. Nonetheless, I think, particularly this committee, has to give some thought to the fact that our capital is more expensive than our competitors, particularly Japan. Why that's so, we can argue all day, but I would, for one, suggest that we do something about the savings rate so as to increase the savings and have our own people at least finance our deficit. I'd love to see that deficit go way down, but at least we shouldn't become further the biggest debtor nation. And therefore, I think savings are a big aspect of this. That's all I have to say, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions and help in any way I can.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. We were noting the other day, just on your last point, that with respect to the degree to which the United States now relies on foreign money to handle our increasing debt, just a few years ago, of the total outstanding federal debt, about 15% of it was held by foreign lenders, and therefore we were dependent upon their willingness to loan us that amount. The total amount of outstanding federal debt's gone way up in the period of time since, but the percentage now held by foreigners has gone up to 20%. So we now have that much higher degree of reliance on being able to attract this foreign money. I'm of the view myself that this upward pressure that we're seeing on interest rates right now is probably going to continue. I mean, nobody can make any meaningful forecast on future interest rates, but I think when you look at the capital needs around the world, and especially now with the Berlin Wall down and the enormous capital requirements in Eastern Europe, the fact that Eastern Europe now is going to have the equivalent of a Marshall Plan that's going to cost hundreds of billions and needs to happen over a relatively prompt period of time. I mean, you can't do it as fast as you might like, and so it'll stretch out over a period of years, but time has to be compressed if we're going to hold even the geopolitics in a relatively stable way. The investments have to go in. And so the World Savings Pool is now has some new people knocking at the door, and that means that the United States, with its enormous appetite for foreign borrowing, is going to find itself having to be in the line with more people seeking capital, even as we invest some capital, say, in Eastern Europe. But I think you mentioned high fees associated with excessive junk bonds, and I'm wondering what costs, if any, do they bear beyond the deals themselves?
I think there is an indirect cost in that they really make for higher prices of companies, obviously by definition, but also by reason of the compulsion that comes from those who are pushing for the deal. If you're going to receive, as a banker or a merchant banker, you're going to receive $20 million if the transaction takes place, and nothing if it doesn't. I think there's a push there that makes for a higher price than would otherwise be the case. And in my short introduction, I referred to the difference in high-yield securities, particularly those that pay cash and those that don't, known as PICs or zeros, etc. I think what's happened over the past several years, the prices of companies have been escalated by use of these non-current pay securities, because when you couldn't justify and finance the current pay of the cash-paying debt and everything else and justify your investment, the gap was filled by what I call these tomorrow securities.
Yeah. Future promises to pay.
And let the future take care of itself. And meantime, you see that the fees were up front. And I think it has to color, all the best of us, it has to color judgment. So that that's what's happening. The excesses were filled in by these particular type of junk bonds, not junk bonds in general, but particular type, all too often. And I think that's a great deal of the excess that we're talking about.
it's very interesting to watch how that philosophy has become more broadly attractive. You know, one of the novel aspects of the savings and loan reform package is that it's largely being financed with zero coupon bonds, so that like that transaction and many others, the systematic using up of the Social Security trust funds for the normal operations of government being another example, we have found that that approach of doing things now and pushing the payment, the real payment, off into the future in some way and loading that debt or that repayment requirement or that financial burden on somebody later has become a very broad practice. It's, you see it now in public finance all over the place.
Called off-balance financing.
Off-balance sheet financing. Off-balance sheet financing is now the order of the day. Right. And the zero coupon bond concept, as it applies in that area, in a sense, is very analogous to what you talk about in terms of these financing arrangements where a transaction really can't, it can't stand the test of producing money now, and so that's finessed, and it's put off into the future, and where it may or may not materialize, and it's now looking as if the future's gotten here quite quickly in some of these deals.
Yes.
And they haven't materialized, and they're being redone.
And the original intent oftentimes is to sell off pieces of the company at higher prices so as to pay off these debt securities. The problem is that that doesn't always work out as anticipated.
Well, and that's quite contrary to the philosophy that you outlined in your statement. You talked about the fact that some years ago, when we thought in terms of leverage buyouts or coming in and doing these restructurings, it was the idea of taking a company and managing it over the long pull in some different way. It wasn't, I take it, as frequently viewed as a situation where you come in and you saw the company into pieces and you sell off pieces as part of an elaborate set of financial transfer activities where there are fees being generated and a lot of front-end money being collected by somebody, and then you end up with a corporate corpus down the line that may not bear much resemblance to what it was that was taken over. It seems to me that that is a radical departure from the earlier philosophy that you spoke about, where a group of people, often including the management, would look at a situation, feel that they could come in, recapitalize it, take over that business, manage it over the long term more efficiently or with fresh energy or what have you, and in effect you've affected the transfer of management and ownership to a large degree, but you've kept the company intact. And that's correct.
And I would add that part of that ingredient is the extra motivation and incentive that comes from ownership, both the investors and the management. Properly done, that motivation of ownership is a wonderful thing, and it does fill this void that I referred to before and that I think has been created since the 50s, when there's really no ownership by the professional management in most of our companies today, the public companies.
Yeah, and I think very little accountability. I think you make the point again as to how, I mean, who moves in is the oversight force that really provides the constructive good on an ongoing business, and I think there has been a gap there, and your reference to pension funds now showing more energy in wanting to have a say as the owners, as you point out, by proxy of half the businesses in the country in behalf of individuals in pensions and what have you, and insurance companies, policyholders and what have you.
Michigan's one of the bigger ones.
Yes, it is. But one of the things that concerns me there is, well, that at least there's a force coming into the vacuum. It seems to me I see a lot of the short-term thinking being applied by pension managers. In other words, it looks to me as if a lot of the time that the pension decisions are driven by short-term considerations, trading performance numbers over a 90-day time period or over a 6-month time period. And it looks to me as if there's an awful lot of transactional activity going on, a lot of churning going on. It's just a personal view that seems to me to be separate and apart from this question of taking the long view. And there are a lot of things that drive this. The tax laws drive this and various other things drive this. But I'm not sure that pensions, the institutional pension manager is going to be able to come in and fulfill that role. And if not, I'm still wondering myself where the discipline comes from. Where can it come from? Or are we still going to be left with a situation where, we're still out of balance in terms of being able to have the natural kinds of mechanisms work, as a sort of an elemental force of authority, if you will, and oversight on what's going on?
Well, I think that, number one, the larger pension funds, and you're talking now about pension funds that have $50–60 billion today, and increasing, have such large positions in companies that they can't really sell. And that's one of the reasons they're very anxious to have more information and a little more say. So they have to be long-term investors. But I think also where they are shorter term, and they're one does have to play the real world of market and show performance. I think we could encourage longer-term thinking by investors by encouraging research, development of our companies. A lot of your captains of industry complain that they can't manage for the long term, that they're penalized if they spend a good deal, too much money or whatever on research, development, and building for the future when it may not be the best thing for the short term. So I think we can encourage that kind of thing by copying some of the things that have been done around the world, like Japan, where they've permitted certain industries to pool research. I think the government can do a lot to communicate, at least there, because a lot's being done. In other words, to encourage this long-term need for efficiency. And at the same time, I think that's why this phenomenon of buyouts does have a legitimate place. And that is because of the ownership. The ownership is by definition long-term, and I've heard a lot of CEOs tell me that they're very, very comfortable like this, much better than being a public company, because they don't have a security analyst coming to them every quarter and saying, how come you're not getting the stock up?
Yeah.
So I think you have to do all these things and think through all these remedies. Not one, but they all should be thought of, thought out, talked out, and coordinated.
When you make a reference to the deficiency of American public company corporate management, say over the last 2 decades, I know you're making a generalization, and you don't mean that to apply to everybody, but taking it as a generalization, if you look at the quality of corporate leadership as you would see it in this area, and grade it on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the top score, as you stack it up against other countries and what they're doing and so forth, where do you think we've come out? Are we up in the high end of that range? Are we in the 5 area? Where would you say we have been generally on average in terms of our top-level private company corporate management performance over the last 2 decades?
I'm not really that familiar with the management of the foreign companies, but I think our managers are pretty darn good. I think the system needs improving. I think it should be geared to performance, long-term performance. I think these fundamentals of that we need to be competitive should be incentivized, preferably without the government, but if need be, by the government. But I do think our managements are very capable, but I think they need to be geared more to performance. I think maybe the gap between the top executive and the other echelons needs to be narrowed, but I think good performance should be rewarded, and it shouldn't be heads I win, tails you lose, which all too often prevails, I think, in our corporate structure today.
Let me switch over to a different area. You mentioned a concern about conflicts of interest, and I thought you put it very well in your statement. How would you suggest that investment banks operate so as to avoid roles that lead to conflicts of interest?
I've had this argument with Wall Street. I don't think that a firm that is geared to fees and commissions should be doing merchant banking, or should be investing as well in their own in a particular transaction. If they want to do one, then they should do that, but if I'm not saying they shouldn't do both in the same company, although I have some reservation about that, because they take different mindsets. And the same way in the banks, I think it's a different mindset to be a trustee for depositors in lending money than what the banks are also currently doing. But I think if an investment banking firm is going to make an investment and in a transaction and represent their own and other people's money, then they shouldn't also be taking fees for that part of the transaction which is basically in conflict, so that they are on both sides of these things, like raising money and investing money in the transaction and getting a fee for the raising of the money.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the occasion...
I think the same thing for lawyers.
Yeah. You don't think that should take place? Is there a lot of that taking place in your view? Has a lot been taking place?
Yeah, I think there's sufficient to be concerned about, and I think there have been even other abuses where firms are representing both buyer and seller, directly or indirectly, or where they have an equity interest that hasn't been brought to light. I think all those things do constitute conflicts. Same way with directors. It's very difficult to be a truly independent director today. And I think we have to give that thought. I think people are goodwill is there, but we're all naturally human. And I think that needs a good deal of scrutiny, talk, and thoughtful dialogue.
When you look at the amount of debt buildup in the country these days, public debt, private debt, a lot of leverage in a lot of directions, do you think we're over-leveraged in total, and are we to the point where it really creates an apprehension in your mind about the levels of debt that are out there?
I'm not really familiar enough with the overall numbers. I think we're going to go through another a continued readjustment, just as Drexel is. I think the people that have taken the risk and have been buying securities, whether it's equity or high-yield securities, have to bite the bullet and take losses when they come. The problem comes in that some of the buyers have been dealing with public monies for which they're trustees, really, and where those kinds of securities should not have been bought. But I think there will be a further shakeout. But I don't think overall that we're over-leveraged. I think our companies properly organized and can compete with Japan, which is a highly leveraged society itself. And the same way with Germany. I think we can compete in our present situation. I think the excesses have to be flushed out.
Seems to me, though, that apart from just managerial quality and other things that might drive competitive performance, that if you've got two sets of players that are highly leveraged, ourselves on the one side and the Germans and the Japanese on the other, and they've got a very low cost of capital, we've got a very high cost of capital, that if you're playing a high leverage game where you start out with an enormous built-in disadvantage, that there's a major structural problem that imposes on you, that you better figure out a way to make up for then in better products, more efficiency, higher productivity, all the things that are very, very hard to accomplish even if you have a low cost of capital. But it seems to me if you're into a high leverage game with a differentially higher cost of capital versus your competitors, that's probably a very good way to make sure that in the end you're going to lose the game.
That's right. That's why a lot of capital is today being supplied by Japan.
Well, and a lot of the earnings and a lot of
that's right.
The future earnings that will come from those investments will accrue to them and not to us.
Exactly, and that's why we need to get our savings so we can have some of that come back here.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you also with respect to the lessons that you draw from the Drexel fall here, and including what you heard this morning as you've sat through the discussion for the most part. What lessons do you take away from this, or should we take away from what we now know happened here?
Well, obviously, the agencies that have the oversight have to be more assiduous, because I think most of what has taken place had been talked about, and I think those agencies tended to sit back in a bit of euphoria. I think the SEC, as I indicated earlier, has to bring the light of day to these things particularly. With the exception of a couple of the things we've been talking about, I don't think there's any legislation that's needed, except as you've touched on today. But I do think, again, the area of fees and conflicts need to be brought out in any situation where the public is involved, because I think these things are not known and really need to be focused on. And I think it's that light of day that's the biggest thing that is needed.
Well, it's very important. We've been fighting to get more light of day on these activities, and we're going to continue to. Does it surprise you to find that two of the outside directors of Drexel would have been former SEC chairmen, and therefore presumably people highly knowledgeable about how you run a company and you keep it from collapsing and how you stay within the rules. And does that strike you as something of an anomaly?
Sure.
A little strange?
I think the whole problem of the revolving door between government and industry is a problem. Mm-hmm. The Wall Street Journal has treated that recently. I think it's not only a problem with you know, the SEC, which reaches out, and I think you have to be careful of those obvious conflicts again. Mm-hmm. I think it's sad. But again, the balance between letting people make a living when they leave government and unfairly taking advantage of that position is a very difficult one. Again, I think if we'd focused on some of these things, we might have avoided Mr. Shadd going, for instance, to the Drexel. I remember talking about this at the time. I was in a minority at the time. I think those are very real problems. Hopefully, again, the light of day on these things will help. But sure, I think it is, to put it mildly, an anomaly.
Let me ask you one other thing. You know, we talk about junk bonds or high-yield securities and how many there are and what their effect is and so forth, and we've certainly seen part of that play out in the Drexel case. How about the bridge lending? We have a hard time understanding how much sort of junk bonds in the making are out there in the form of bridge loans that aren't quite as apparent to the naked eye, that are here, there, and wherever, as they try to make their way into the marketplace, which is now changed. Do you have any sense for the overhang of that activity and what problems there may be that attach to it? Do you have any feel for it that you can help us with? Again,
I'm not involved in that. I don't see it. I know there are firms, whether it's First Boston, Merrill Lynch, I forget, Salomon, even Goldman, have, I think, bridge loans still outstanding that may or may not be well secured. I know the New York Stock Exchange is concerned about it because they're outside the broker-dealer usually. They're up in the holding company or in another subsidiary. And whether those pieces of paper are translated into other high-yielding pieces of paper, I think the fundamental worth of those has to be very carefully scrutinized, because obviously they're used by the firms as collateral for loans from the banks. Exactly. So you have to worry about the banks that are lending to people that lend these bridge loans. Yeah, and when I think there is a concern out there. Yeah, and when you say banks, you're talking about banks that have insured deposits, and where the taxpayer is in effect on the hook for the ultimate outcome of those transactions. Should we experience any sort of major failure? Oh, sure. Well, I mean, if you take the analogy with the high yield, the junk bonds, some of them have gone down to 10, 20 cents on the dollar. Now, if the bridge loans have any kind of diminution like that, it's cause for scrutiny. Should we undertake, by one means or another, to get the information and be able to monitor that as a matter of just good public policy and a matter of the public interest? It's a somewhat new phenomenon. In other words, the leveraged buyout movement has grown to such a size and character that these bridge loans are an element of the puzzle that may not have been present in the same way years past. Is this something that
because it might pose a systemic risk or even a risk to a major firm where the public could get hurt by one way or another, that we should really start tracking the level of that activity?
Certainly. I don't, you mean by this committee?
Well, somebody. I mean, whether it's the SEC having the power to reach in and do it. I mean, it seems to me that in the interests of making sure markets will work and that they're not going to, be blown apart by mistake or by excess, and that the public's interests in terms of providing deposit insurance through an insured institution that is connected in a chain where it can be damaged and the public can be damaged by unforeseen failures cropping up. We've apparently managed to avoid that in the Drexel case, but it sounds to me like that there was a bit of luck involved in that, as well as good work. I mean, the next time we might not be that lucky.
Well, I still have some bridge loans, sure. And I think the answer has to be yes. I know the New York Stock Exchange is endeavoring to look into this because it affects their membership. I'm sure it does on the NASD as well. And anything that impacts the public, which is supposed to be protected by the overseers, should be looked into. I mean, if I do a transaction completely privately, but take a bridge loan of $500 million, that all of a sudden, when markets change, is worth $200 million, that $300 million difference comes out of the firm that made the bridge loan. And that in turn could impact their broker-dealer and the public. So I think it is a very legitimate concern.
And now I'm just wondering, with the junk bond market having fallen as much as it has, and with Drexel now out of the game, and the real question about the liquidity in terms of trading for some of these junk bonds that are out there. Some trade more readily, obviously, than others. I'm wondering if we shouldn't now try to figure out promptly how many bridge loans are outstanding and who has them, because it's a very important capital issue, a capital sufficiency issue. And if it turns out that we've got, in a sense, what are de facto junk bond portfolios that we call bridge loans, because they're in a different form at the moment, but they're nevertheless being counted as a part of an equity base that's providing an important part of the presumed capital to run the system. If we've had an erosion there and we've got problems there in one or more places, and maybe it adds up to a fairly large overall problem, it seems to me that's something we'd better know, isn't it?
I don't think it's at all premature.
Well, we might ask your thoughts, and we're going to have to do some work to figure out how we collect that information. I have a concern about just the question of who holds the junk bonds. It's a separate matter, but we've looked at the list, and about 30% of outstanding junk bonds, this is a related point, are held by insurance companies, about 30% by pension funds. But you've got some situations, going back to this point we were making earlier about zero coupon bonds and gimmicks that involve, take now, pay later type arrangements, where some pension funds have been emptied out and exchanged for promised annuities based on junk bond payments that may or may not come due at some future date. So that not only have excess buildup amounts been taken out of the pension funds that would have protected the long-term viability of the pensions to be paid to the people who would get them, but not only has that excess been taken out in many cases, but they've been replaced at the base level by high-yield securities that may or may not pay off in the future. We still don't know the extent to which that's been done or where, but it's coming on our radar screen as a matter of concern. The same thing with certain insurance companies that made obligations to pay in the future based on that kind of an arrangement, which may not hold together. And we don't monitor the insurance industry per se here in Washington. It's done at the fifth level of the 50 states, and so it's somewhat out of our line of vision. But when you see large holdings of junk bonds being accumulated in entities like that, where there are future promises to pay that are contingent upon those instruments holding their value, I start to get concerned about that. I start to get concerned about what constitutes too much or a bad balance or something that's going to cause somebody who's relying on a promise that their pension will be paid or their insurance policy will be paid, that will find out later on down the line that there's no money there. And so the ripples that go off, the implications that go off in different directions are now taking on some of these dimensions, and we're trying to track this down. It's not easy to do. Any other comments you'd like to make before we conclude here today?
No, just that if I can be of help anytime, I'd be happy to.
Well, I appreciate your coming today. I know that. Let me just announce before we adjourn that on the matter of the 5 pending nominations, a quorum was established, and all 5 nominees will be favorably reported to the full Senate. The vote was unanimous, 21-0. The committee stands in recess.
Broadcast around the world via the WorldNet system. Viewers outside the United States seeking more information about the C-SPAN networks should write to us at C-SPAN.